The night it all began smelled of smoke and betrayal. Sirens wailed across the factory grounds, red lights slicing through the night sky, reflecting off the broken glass of windows that had once housed his dreams. He stood there, too stunned to breathe, watching flames eat the building he had given his life to. Every scream, every crackle of fire sounded like a verdict. He hadn't even been on shift that night. But as the crowd gathered, someone whispered his name. It spread like poison in the air, his name, carried by tongues eager for a villain. When the fire was finally brought under control, investigators combed through the wreckage. Hours later, a security guard emerged holding something in a gloved hand. His work ID card. The cameras clicked, reporters shouted questions, and he felt his world tilt beneath his feet. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words never reached the crowd. All they saw was his badge, pulled from the ashes, like proof from the hands of fate itself. The next day, the CEO stood before the press, polished and unshaken, a man who spoke in hard truths. His voice rang out across every television screen in the city. "We are horrified by this act of negligence. This disaster cost us millions, but more than that, it nearly cost lives. And we hold one man, accountable." His name thundered through the broadcast like a death sentence. His colleagues, the same men and women who had once shared drinks with him, looked away when they saw him on the street. His neighbors whispered when he walked past their windows. His family's phone stopped ringing. Overnight, he had become a pariah. He lost his job, his friends, and soon after his family. His wife packed her bags in silence, too ashamed to fight for a man the world despised. His daughter, too young to understand, cried as she was carried away, leaving him in a house that grew emptier by the hour. And when the lawsuits came demanding millions he didn't have, he sank deeper. The CEO made sure his name was buried so far beneath scandal that no company dared touch him again. 10 years of struggle began that night, and every day felt like a prison without walls. But silence can be sharper than any blade. While the city mocked him, while the CEO bathed in applause, he sharpened himself on the whetstone of ruin. Nights spent in tiny apartments, mornings that began with rejection letters, afternoons wasted knocking on doors that never opened. He endured them all. Piece by piece, he learned the business from the ground up again. Small contracts, forgotten clients, opportunities others dismissed. He took them, built them, nurtured them. Every cent he earned, he invested. Every betrayal he suffered, he stored in his memory like fuel. Years passed, and the man they had labeled disgraced grew invisible. That was his greatest weapon. No one saw him coming. While the CEO's empire swelled with arrogance, he built a rival empire in the shadows. One day, almost without noticing, his company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. His workers respected him, his partners trusted him, and his balance sheets gleamed with numbers his enemies would have killed for. He looked into the mirror one morning and saw not a broken man, but a predator ready to hunt. 10 years had turned humiliation into armor and pain into purpose. The question was no longer whether he could rise again. The question was how far the CEO would fall when the tables finally turned, and he already had a plan. But plans are never clean. They always draw blood. And his first move was going to leave the CEO gasping for air. The first strike had to be invisible. Revenge wasn't about rage, it was about patience. He spent months studying the veins of the CEO's company, mapping its weaknesses, identifying every crack in its foundation. Suppliers who felt underpaid, contractors who had been discarded, board members who had grown tired of the CEO's iron grip. One by one, he reached out to them. A drink here, a quiet meeting there, a promise whispered in the dark. His rival empire had money now, influence, leverage, and he wielded them like scalpels. The CEO noticed it first in small ways. A shipment delayed, a contract canceled, profits slipping by percentages so small the board barely flinched. But then came the strikes that couldn't be ignored. A massive supplier, one who had worked with the company for decades, suddenly withdrew, signing instead with the rival firm. A foreign investor pulled their funding without explanation. Rumors began to swirl in the market, whispers that the once mighty giant was losing its edge. The CEO raged in meetings, slamming fists on polished tables, demanding answers. His executives scrambled with spreadsheets and excuses, but none could explain the decay, spreading like rot through the company's bones. He didn't know it yet, but every collapse, every failure, every whisper of doubt was orchestrated. And then came the meeting that would change everything. The board convened on a rainy morning, the sky outside heavy with storm clouds. The CEO marched in, ready to assert control, but the room felt colder than usual. Shareholders avoided his gaze, their eyes fixed on the door. And when it finally opened, the sound of footsteps echoed like judgment. There he was, the man they had destroyed, the man whose name they had spat on a decade ago, walking into the room with calm authority, not in chains this time, but in a tailored suit, flanked by advisors, carrying documents that bore the weight of power. He didn't need to announce himself. The silence did it for him. The CEO's face drained of color, his voice cracking as he demanded, "What is he doing here?" The answer came in a stack of papers slid across the boardroom, table, contracts, signatures, transactions. The rival company had not just overtaken them in the market, it had consumed them. Piece by piece, deal by deal, he had bought his way into their fortress until he now held the keys. The board had already signed off. He was their majority stakeholder. The CEO's empire no longer belonged to him. The man who had been branded a criminal stood at the head of the table, smiling a smile sharpened by 10 years of rage. "I believe we'll be discussing the future of this company," he said softly. And for the first time in his career, the CEO had no words. But this was not the end, not yet. The fall of a man like that could never be confined to a single room. And what came next would not just ruin him, it would break him. The boardroom should have been his sanctuary, but that morning it became his graveyard. The CEO sat frozen, his hands clutching the armrests of his chair as though the leather could anchor him against the tide swallowing his empire. The rival, no, the man he had tried to bury, stood tall before him, calm as stone, and laid out the truth. He wasn't just a shareholder. He was the largest one now. The majority. The power in the room had shifted entirely, and everyone could feel it. The board members didn't meet the CEO's eyes. Some looked relieved, some even eager. For years they had endured his arrogance, his iron-fisted control. Now they had someone new to rally behind. Someone who had proven he could build a company from nothing, in the shadows under fire. Their loyalty was crumbling, and the CEO felt it like a knife twisting into his ribs. He tried to fight back. Words spilled from him, desperate and sharp. Accusations of betrayal, threats of legal action, promises that his lawyers would shred these contracts to pieces. But the documents on the table were airtight. Every signature had been secured, every loophole already closed. He was cornered, and he knew it. The new majority stakeholder leaned forward, his voice low, each word dripping with 10 years of venom. "You ruined me once. You made me the villain so you could play the hero. But the thing about lies, they rot, and yours has finally caught up to you." The CEO wanted to lunge across the table, to tear those smug words from his rival's throat, but rage couldn't hide the truth anymore. The power he had wielded for decades was gone, stripped from him in a single morning, and yet the humiliation wasn't over. The cameras were waiting. As the meeting adjourned, the disgraced man who was now king made sure the press had been invited. They stood outside the building in the rain, microphones raised, eyes hungry. When the board filed out, reporters swarmed them, demanding to know if rumors were true, that the CEO had been ousted, that a rival had taken over. The CEO shoved his way through the chaos, rain soaking his perfect suit, his jaw clenched so tight he thought it might shatter. Reporters screamed his name. They weren't begging for quotes anymore. They wanted blood. He ducked his head, but cameras caught everything. His pale face, his trembling hands, his silence. The man who had once stood on stages, condemning an innocent employee, was now running from the spotlight. The irony was so sharp it almost cut the air. He escaped into his car, slamming the door, his driver too afraid to speak. Through the tinted glass, he caught one last glimpse of his rival standing on the steps, giving the press the soundbite they craved. "Justice takes time," he said softly, his eyes locking with the camera. "But it always comes." The CEO looked away, bile rising in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not pride, fear. And he knew deep down that this was just the beginning, because men like his rival didn't stop at victory. They stopped only when their enemies were ashes. Sleep abandoned him that night. The CEO paced the floor of his mansion, the rain outside tapping against the windows like mocking fingers. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that face again, the man he had condemned, now smiling like a wolf who had tasted blood. His empire had been taken in the daylight. But what terrified him more was the shadow of what might come next. By morning, the news had spread. Every paper, every website, every commentator reveled in his downfall. Headlines screamed his humiliation, CEO ousted in boardroom coup, and rival firm seizes control. Social media tore him apart, videos of his rain-soaked escape playing on loop. Memes mocked his expressions, his collapse, his silence. For a man who had thrived on control, losing it in public was worse than death. But he still had money, influence, connections, or so he thought. Calls to old allies went unanswered. Messages to investors bounced back with polite rejections. Even his closest confidants distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged down with him. One by one, the lifelines he had counted on snapped. The rival had poisoned the well, cutting off every escape route. And then came the personal strike. He arrived home to find his mansion buzzing with strangers, auditors, lawyers, officials, frozen accounts, seized assets, investigations reopened. His rival hadn't just taken his company. He had opened doors the CEO thought were locked forever. Old secrets were crawling into the light, embezzlements, bribes, the skeletons hidden in polished closets. Every dirty deal he had buried was being unearthed, one after another. The CEO screamed at them to leave, but their badges gave them power. He threw glasses against the wall, shattered furniture, cursed every name he could remember. But rage couldn't erase the truth. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. And the man he had wronged was holding the key. At night, the mansion felt colder. Hallways echoed with silence. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder, convinced someone was watching. His rival's face haunted him, not through threats or letters, but through the suffocating weight of inevitability. Every empire falls, and his was collapsing brick by brick. He sat alone in his study, staring at the flames of the fireplace, trying to convince himself he could still fight back. But in the reflection of the glass, he thought he saw something. A figure faint standing just behind him. He spun around, nothing but shadows. The fear crawled deeper into his bones, because it wasn't just his company, or his wealth, or his name being taken. It was his mind. And he began to wonder, how far would his rival go? Would he stop at ruin, or would he demand blood? The mansion grew quieter with each passing day, but the silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. The CEO once filled his halls with parties, guests, and the laughter of powerful men who drank his wine and whispered his praises. Now the same men refused to take his calls. His wealth, once displayed in gold fixtures and imported paintings, was now surrounded by auditors cataloging every item. Even his staff abandoned him, leaving the rooms empty, echoing with reminders of a life slipping away. But the greatest wound wasn't the betrayal of his allies. It was his family. His wife had endured years of his arrogance, standing at his side not out of love but for the image, the wealth, the power. Now that power was gone, and with it, her loyalty. She left without a fight, her lawyers demanding a divorce, settlement that made headlines before the papers even hit his desk. Her interviews painted him as unstable, controlling, dangerous. Every word was a dagger twisted for the public to see. And his children. They had long since distanced themselves, embarrassed by his scandals, weary of his temper. But now they spoke openly against him. One son went on television, declaring he wanted nothing to do with the legacy of corruption his father had built. Another wrote an article condemning him. Even his daughter, the one he once swore to protect, refused to return his calls. Their silence was worse than their words. He sat in his study, staring at family portraits that no longer felt like his own. The rival had not just stripped away his empire. He had taken away the illusion that he was ever truly loved. Alone with no allies, no family, and dwindling wealth, the CEO clung to the only thing left to him, pride. But pride could not stop the unraveling. The rival's strategy was relentless. Lawsuits piled higher each week, each exposing another skeleton from the CEO's past. Media outlets devoured the stories, turning his name into a punchline. Late-night hosts mocked him. Former employees came forward with tales of abuse, painting him as a tyrant. His reputation, once his most prized possession, was shredded in front of millions. One evening, desperate, he tried to confront his rival directly. He showed up unannounced at the rival's new headquarters, storming past reception, shouting his name. Security intercepted him within seconds, escorting him out as if he were a common trespasser. Cameras outside the building caught every humiliating moment. The former titan of industry shoved aside like a vagrant. The rival didn't even bother to appear. That cut deeper than any insult. To be ignored was worse than to be hated. And so, the CEO sat in his car afterward, shaking, his fists pounding the dashboard. He screamed until his throat burned, but no sound could drown the truth. His rival was winning not just the war of power, but the war of perception, because soon the world wouldn't just see him as defeated. They would see him as irrelevant. And irrelevance was the one fate he feared above all. The nights became unbearable. Sleep wouldn't come, and when it did, it brought nightmares, visions of flames, of headlines, of his rival's cold smile. He drank to silence them, but the bottles only made the shadows darker. He thought he saw things, figures outside the window, whispers in the hallways, doors closing by themselves. Rationally, he knew it was paranoia, but fear isn't rational, and his rival's silence was the loudest threat of all. One night, he received a letter. No signature, just a single sheet of paper slipped under his door. "Do you remember the fire?" His hands shook as he read it. There was no return address, no explanation, just those 5 words stabbing into his chest like a knife. He tore it up, burned it in the fireplace, told himself it was nothing, but the words haunted him. The fire, the very disaster that had started it all, the one he had blamed on an innocent man, was still out there, lingering like smoke that refused to fade. More letters followed. Always short, always sharp. Truth rots in silence. Ashes remember. You cannot bury the dead. He didn't know if it was his rival sending them or someone else entirely. But each note eroded the walls of his sanity. He became a prisoner in his own home, curtains drawn. Locks checked 3 times a night. His empire had fallen. His wealth was crumbling. And now his mind was turning against him. Desperate, he reached out to the press, demanding an interview. He needed to control the narrative, to remind people who he was. But the interview turned into a spectacle. The anchor cornered him with questions about the fire, about the disgraced worker who had returned, his stammered denials, his sweaty palms, his outbursts of anger. It all played live, streaming across millions of screens. The next morning, headlines called him broken, unhinged, a fallen king. He smashed his television, shards scattering across the floor, but the noise inside his head wouldn't stop. He could hear echoes of the rival's voice, though the man hadn't spoken a word to him since the takeover. Every silence, every unanswered call, was its own kind of torture. And then, one evening, as he sat in his study drowning in whiskey, he saw something outside the window. A car, black engine running, headlights off. It didn't move. For hours it didn't move. When he finally gathered the courage to check again, the street was empty. But on his doorstep there was another letter. Tomorrow. His heart pounded so loud he thought it would tear through his chest. Tomorrow, what? Tomorrow what would happen? And for the first time, he realized he wasn't waiting for ruin anymore. He was waiting for judgment. The word tomorrow clung to him like a curse. He barely slept that night, pacing the mansion's halls until dawn. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light outside, sent his nerves into spirals. His paranoia had grown into a living thing, breathing down his neck with every step. He tried to convince himself it was just another taunt, a mind game designed to break him. But deep down he knew something was coming. When morning broke, the world seemed colder. Rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the windows as though warning him of what lay ahead. He brewed coffee with trembling hands, but couldn't swallow more than a sip. He turned on the news, only to find his rival's face again. Confident, respected, admired. Analysts spoke of his brilliance, his rise, his moral victory. In the corner of the screen, the CEO's name appeared as a cautionary tale. By afternoon, the waiting became unbearable. He shut off his phone, locked his doors, drew the curtains tight. But the silence outside was worse than noise. Hours stretched like days, every tick of the clock hammering against his skull. Then came the knock. It was soft, deliberate, echoing through the empty mansion like a gunshot. He froze. His legs refused to move, his breath caught in his chest. Another knock followed, louder this time, the sound of inevitability. He forced himself to the door, heart rattling like a trapped bird. And when he opened it, the storm outside surged in, along with a figure he had both feared and hated for a decade. The rival stood there, rain dripping from his coat, eyes sharp as knives. He didn't ask permission to enter. He stepped inside like he owned the place. And in truth he did. Every inch of the CEO's life now belonged to him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The mansion's silence wrapped around them, broken only by the storm outside. The CEO wanted to scream, to lunge, to beg, but the weight of 10 years pressed against his chest, holding him still. Finally, the rival broke the silence. "You remember the fire, don't you?" The CEO's throat closed. His mind raced. He wanted to deny, to claim ignorance. But the truth hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. The fire had never been his employee's fault. It had been his own negligence, his own cost-cutting, his own greed. And when disaster struck, he had needed someone to take the fall. The employee was perfect, innocent, loyal, disposable. The rival stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I begged you to listen. I told you the truth, and you destroyed me for it." The CEO backed away, stumbling against his own desk, his hands shaking. His rival wasn't shouting, wasn't raging. That made it worse. The calm was unbearable, the measured cruelty of a man who had waited a decade for this moment. "What do you want from me?" the CEO rasped. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "Money? Power? You already have everything." The rival's eyes burned with something deeper than greed. "I don't want what you have. I want you to feel what I felt, to watch everything burn, knowing no one believes you, no one will save you, and no one cares." The CEO's knees buckled, his body collapsing into the chair behind him. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless, not because of contracts or money or lawsuits, but because the truth he had buried was finally standing in front of him, alive, unbroken, and demanding a reckoning. And then the rival pulled a folder from his coat, tossing it onto the desk. Photos, documents, evidence of the fire, proof of the lies, proof of the cover-up. The CEO's blood ran cold. This wasn't just revenge, this was exposure. And tomorrow the whole world would know. The folder sat between them like a ticking bomb. The CEO's trembling hands reached for it, flipping through the pages, his eyes widening with every photograph, every email, every damning detail. The rival had everything. Proof of the safety shortcuts, the ignored warnings, the deliberate scapegoating. It was enough to ruin him 100 times over. "No one will believe this," the CEO whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. His rival leaned forward, eyes locked on him. "They will," he said, "because this time I hold the microphone." The CEO shook his head violently, his face red with panic. "You'll destroy me. You'll erase me from the world." The rival's reply was colder than the rain outside. "You already erased yourself the night you chose me to blame." The words pierced deeper than any lawsuit ever could. The CEO's chest tightened, his breath shallow. Memories of that night surged back. The fire, the cameras, the speeches he gave while an innocent man's life burned in silence. He had told himself it was necessary, that sacrifice was the price of power. But sitting here, face to face with the man he betrayed, he realized what it had truly been: cowardice. He tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He collapsed to the floor, gripping the desk for support. "Please," he whispered, the word foreign in his mouth. "Please don't do this. I'll give you anything." The rival crouched down, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Do you know what kept me alive these 10 years? It wasn't money. It wasn't hope. It was imagining this moment, seeing you beg." Tears welled in the CEO's eyes. The once mighty titan of industry, who had commanded rooms and crushed rivals, was reduced to a broken man kneeling at the feet of the one he had wronged. The mansion felt colder now, its grand halls reduced to a tomb. The rival rose, leaving the folder on the desk. "Tomorrow morning, the evidence goes public. Your name, your crimes, your lies, everything. And when the world turns on you, I won't need to lift a finger. You'll finish yourself." He walked to the door, his coat trailing rainwater on the polished floor. The CEO scrambled after him, shouting, pleading, but the rival never turned back. The door closed with a final click, leaving him in suffocating silence. All night, the CEO sat in the dark, the folder open before him. He saw headlines flashing in his mind, faces laughing, crowds jeering. He saw his family's disgust, his children's hatred, the world's mockery. He imagined prison, disgrace, oblivion. And for the first time, he realized the rival hadn't come to kill him. The rival had come to make him kill himself, slowly, with despair, with fear, with the unbearable weight of truth. As dawn broke, the CEO poured himself a final drink. His hands no longer shook. The mansion around him was silent, waiting. He looked once more at the folder, then at the glass in his hand. The choice was his, and as the sun rose over the city, one empire lay in ashes, and another stood tall. The rival had won. Not through murder, not through violence, but through patience, truth, and a vengeance sharpened by time. The CEO's fall was complete. This is Karma Unfolded, where every secret finds its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.